In the Iowa District Court for Scott County, State of Iowa Plaintiff versus Henry E. Dinkins, Defendant. Criminal number FECR 415636, the trial information. Comes now Michael J. Walton as County Attorney of Scott County, State of Iowa, and in the name and by the authority of the State of Iowa, accuses Henry E. Dinkins of the following crimes. Count 1, murder in the first degree. The said Henry E. Dinkins, on or about the 10th day of July, 2020, in the County of Scott and State of Iowa, did commit murder in the first degree, in violation of Section 707.2 of the Code of Iowa, by willfully, deliberately, and with premeditation, kill B.T., as defined in Section 707.2, subparagraph 1A of the Code of Iowa, or did kill B.T. while participating in a forcible felony, to wit, kidnapping in the first degree, in violation of Section 707.2, subparagraph 1B of the Code of Iowa. Count 2, kidnapping in the first degree. The said Henry E. Dinkins, on or about the 10th day of July, 2020, in the County of Scott and State of Iowa, did confine or remove B.T. without authority or consent or by deception, with the intent to inflict serious injury or subject her to sexual abuse, and in so doing caused her death in violation of Section 710.2 of the Code of Iowa. A true information, Michael J. Walton, County Attorney. To these charges, the defendant has entered pleas of not guilty.
Thank you, Ms. Cunningham. You may proceed with your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. And Your Honor, Ms. O'Donnell is now able to join us, so I would just ask her to come to the council table if she would.
She may.
May it please the court. Counsel, Mr. Dinkins. Your Honor, the facts that you're going to hear about involve individuals who were involved in some type of family relationship. And initially what I'm going to do is I'm going to identify the various parties, describe the relationship that existed amongst the various parties, and from there then I'll walk through the facts of this particular case. Breasia Terrell, during the period of July of 2020, was a 10-year-old girl. Her mother is Aisha Langford. Breasia had an older brother with the initials of CS, who was 13 during this period of time, and she had a younger brother by the name of DL, who was 8 years of age. Henry Dinkins is the biological father of DL. He is not the biological father of Breasia Terrell, and he is not the biological father of the older boy, CS, who was 13 at the time. Aisha Langford is going to get on the stand, and she's going to testify that she met Henry Dinkins when she was around 18 or 19 years of age. And by virtue of the relationship that they had, she became pregnant, and that's when she had conceived DL. As far as describing the relationship that she had with Henry Dinkins over the course of DL's life, she will testify that he was not a father who was actively engaged in the child's life. He was not an individual who would spend a lot of time with his son. He was not an individual that his son would go visit on a regular occasion. In fact, he was not an individual who was actively providing regular support to the family. At any rate, with that being said, that takes us to the time frame of June of 2020. Now, during the summer of 2020, Aisha Langford will testify that, in fact, there was opportunities to spend time at an activity where Henry Dinkins was located at. There were cookouts that were taking place. That would have happened during June of 2020. She and the children were participants in that cookout that Mr. Dinkins was responsible for putting on. And then during that period of time, Aisha Langford had the opportunity to meet a young woman by the name of Andrea Culberson. Andrea Culberson was a woman who was the girlfriend of Henry Dinkins, and she will testify that she had been involved in a 6-year relationship with Henry Dinkins. Now, Andrea Culberson, she lived over at the Jersey Meadow Apartments. The address is 2744 Jersey Meadow Apartments, number 8. And that was an apartment that she was sharing with Henry Dinkins. With the backdrop of what had occurred in June of 2020, Aisha Langford will testify that around July 8th, she was traveling in her car with her son, DL, and happened to see the defendant travel past them and pull into a quick shop. DL expressed an interest in wanting to spend some time with his father. That prompted Aisha Langford to pull into the quick shop, engage Mr. Dinkins in a conversation, and indicate to him that he needed to spend some time with his son. By virtue of that conversation, Mr. Dinkins indicated that he would take the child, for a few days and spend some time with him. And so arrangements had been made for him to call, to come pick up DL, and the date that that particular event played out was actually on July 9th of 2020. Now, Aisha was actively employed. She worked at the Checkers located on East Locust. And just for purposes of perspective, because this will become important later on in testimony, if you think of the area where Sudlow Junior High is located at, there on Locust Street, and just about a half block down the street to the east, that's the Checkers that Aisha Langford worked at. She actually was working on the morning and afternoon of July 9th when Henry Dinkins had responded to her mother, Danita Gardner's residence to pick up Detorius. And relative to the plans that existed, the plans very simply were for Henry Dinkins to take his son and only his son. Aisha Langford will testify that while during her relationship, when she became pregnant with DL and Breasia was about 2 years of age, he was not a father figure to Breasia. Breasia had a different father. And so then when Henry Dinkins responded to Danita Gardner's residence somewhere around 11 o'clock that morning to pick up Detorius, the circumstances changed. Aisha will testify that Detorius is very close to his sister Breasia. And quite honestly, they are attached at the hip to one another. Detorius expressed an interest for his sister, Breasia, and I should say DL, excuse me, expressed an interest for his sister, Breasia, to come along. Ms. Gardner took the position that that was an issue that would need to be discussed with the children's mother once she got home. Breasia was very much interested in being able to go with her brother because it was going to be a fun outing. And actually, the 13-year-old boy, CS, expressed an interest in being able to go along as well. Henry Dinkins indicated that Breasia was welcome to come along, but he indicated that the 13-year-old boy, CS, could not come along, and the reason that he offered up for that was there was not enough room in his car for the 3 children. The day that he picked Detorius up and Breasia came along, he was operating a black Camaro, and that black Camaro had seating both for front seat passengers and back seat passengers. At any rate, Mr. Dinkins left the Gardner residence with DL and with Breasia, and then through testimony or statements provided by Mr. Dinkins and even information provided by DL, who was later interviewed through the Davenport Police Department, they both described going over to a residence that was a friend of Mr. Dinkins. This individual was identified as Vincent Howard, who lived on Taylor Street. They went over. There was time spent there at the Howard residence. Both of the children spent the afternoon playing video games. Mr. Dinkins left the residence for a period of time, came back, and then after they finished spending time there at the Howard residence, Mr. Dinkins took the two children over to 2744 on East 53rd Street to the apartment that he shared with Andrea Culberson. Now, at this point in time, I want to discuss the location of that apartment complex so that the court understands where it's located. On 53rd, we have Costco. The Jersey Meadow apartment complex is actually that apartment complex which is directly to the west of Costco. So it would be on the north side of the street. When Henry got back to the apartment complex, they all went inside. I think it's important to describe the layout of the apartment because that will be something that will become a topic of discussion later on. Apartment number 8 actually was a second-level apartment. Now, this particular complex is not the type of apartment complex where you have, you know, a common entryway and a common hallway that individuals would use to access apartments on a first floor or apartments on a second floor. In this particular apartment complex, each apartment has its own individual dedicated door for entry into the apartment. So that if you live in a second-story apartment, when you walk in that front door, you have a staircase inside the apartment that you take up to that second floor. Apartment number 8, if you enter that door, and on the right side of what would be that exterior wall would be the staircase. When you get to the top of the staircase, and then if you look over to the left, it's an open area that would consist of the living room, the kitchen, and dining room combination. There was only one bedroom in apartment number 8. And so the front door, if it's, you know, to the one wall of the apartment, when you go up the stairs, the door into that bedroom actually is just set off, just a little bit further to the left, and you go into that bedroom. In order to utilize the restroom in that apartment, that requires an individual to walk into that bedroom because the bathroom is only accessible through the bedroom. And that becomes another critical point that I'll talk about later in my opening statement. After Mr. Dinkins and the children got back to the apartment, it was a normal evening. Andrea Culberson, Mr. Dinkins' girlfriend, she works for AT&T, and she actually works out of her home. She was working till sometime around 7:30 that evening. While she was working, Breasia was very, very interested in the type of work that she was doing, and Ms. Culberson was showing her how she performed her responsibilities for AT&T. Detorius was playing video games in the living room. Andrea Culberson's desk where she works is set up in the bedroom. So Breasia was in the bedroom, and at some point in time, Breasia was playing video games as well, but within the bedroom. Now, one of the things that Andrea Culberson will speak to, and that DL may speak to, is the fact that Henry Dinkins was spending time in the bedroom with Breasia while she played video games. Andrea Culberson will testify that the three of them, herself, Mr. Dinkins, and Breasia were in the bedroom and they were playing a game together. And that's essentially how the evening was playing out. Now, when Aisha Langford got off of work from Checkers late that afternoon, she had been notified by her mother that Henry Dinkins had taken Breasia. And so therefore, there would be the need to pack up clothes for the children. Aisha went back to the residence. She packed up a bag of clothing for Breasia, and she packed up clothing for Detorius, which would have included pajamas for both of the children. And I make that point for a reason. because that will become the subject of conversation as I proceed through my opening statement. Aisha responds to the apartment complex. This was not a complex that she was familiar with. She'd never been to the Culberson apartment before. At any rate, when she responded to the complex, she called to notify the parties that she was out in the parking lot, and Breasia came down to gather the clothing. Mom had the family pet with them, the dog. Breasia was really excited about it. In fact, Breasia wanted to take the dog with her up to the apartment. Mom had to call her back and say, no, the family pet's going home. But at any rate, you know, it was one of those, give the clothes, love you, have a wonderful time. And then Aisha left with Breasia going back inside the apartment complex, or I should say apartment number 8, with the clothing. After Aisha left the Jersey Meadow apartment, she took a right-hand turn on 53rd, so she's traveling west. The weather that night is also an issue that becomes very important to talk about, because as she was traveling north and got to the area of North High, there was a significant thunderstorm that broke out. And it was raining so hard that her windshield wipers would not keep up, so she had to pull over into a driveway and wait until the rain subsided before she went back to her apartment. And I believe she was staying with Benita Gardner. The family was in transition, and then they were moving back. She got back to the apartment, was very tired, having worked all day, took a bath, and very simply, she fell asleep on the couch, and she was out for the evening. At some point, unbeknownst to her, the children, DL and Breasia, neither of which had cell phones that they could take with them to the Culberson apartment. She had received a telephone call from Henry Dinkins' phone that was unanswered. And then the caller became very apparent, because then there was a text message that came through from Breasia saying, "Good night, Mommy, I love you." All right. So that was somewhere around 10, 11 o'clock in the evening. As far as how the evening played out at the Culberson apartment, leading up to bedtime, each of the children took baths in the bedroom separately. They were fed some dinner, and then Detorius and Breasia were to sleep in the bedroom on the bed. Miss Culberson had a blow-up mattress that was out in the living room on the floor where she and Mr. Dinkins were to sleep. Breasia was the first one to go to bed, and from the living room you could actually look through the door of the bedroom and you could see the bed, because if you're standing at the doorway of the bedroom, very simply you look forward and the bed is straight ahead of you. And then the headboard of the bed actually is right underneath a big window. That window actually looks out into the parking lot of the apartment complex, and that will become very important for later discussions that I'm going to have in my opening statement. So Breasia goes to bed first. Andrea Culberson lays down to go to sleep. Detorius, she can hear Mr. Dinkins say to him that he has so much time to play the video game and that he's going down to bed. And then Detorius was in the bedroom asleep. When Miss Culberson went to sleep, the last that she knew of Mr. Dinkins and his whereabouts was that he was there in the living room on the couch. Miss Culberson is a very heavy sleeper, and she'll testify to that. At 3 a.m. in the morning, she woke up because she needed to use the bathroom. When she woke up, she discovered that Mr. Dinkins was not there in the living room. That seemed odd to her. She got up, went into the bedroom. She noticed DL sleeping at the foot of the bed, but where little Breasia had fallen asleep, on the right-hand side and toward the top of the bed, there were simply the covers that had been folded over, and there was no child there. There was a sense of alarm. She went to the bathroom to use the bathroom, but she decided to get her glasses and put her glasses on to make sure that Breasia wasn't there. And Breasia was not there. Mr. Dinkins wasn't there, and Breasia wasn't there. Ms. Culberson will testify that she had a very uneasy feeling about that. So then she stayed up in the living room, sitting in the dark. Now at 3:30 a.m. in the morning, and this is a time specific, because she had looked at a clock that was on her desk that said it was 3:30 in the morning, she heard Mr. Dinkins very quietly open the door and very quietly come up the stairs into the apartment. And she wanted to know where he was at and where Breasia was at. Mr. Dinkins wasn't really responding to questions other than just to say something very circumspect. He went into the bedroom, flipped on a light, and then went to his closet. Now, if we talk about the bedroom itself, when you're standing there in the doorway, on the left-hand side, that's where you would access the bathroom. And then, again, there is a closet on that side. That was Miss Culberson's closet, where she kept her personal belongings. On the right side of the bed, there was a closet where Mr. Dinkins kept his things. She will testify that Mr. Dinkins went to that closet. He was rummaging around through things. She's wanting to know where Breasia is at. He's rummaging through things. She happens to pull back the curtain to the window and looks out, and little Breasia is standing by a maroon Chevy Impala on the passenger side of the vehicle. Now, there are going to be three vehicles that the court's going to be hearing about. The maroon Chevy Impala, which was a vehicle that was used by Mr. Dinkins and Miss Culberson. And then the black Camaro. The maroon Chevy Impala had characteristics that become very important relative to investigations that was conducted by the Davenport Police Department. There were dark tinted windows on the Impala, and then on the trunk, on the right-hand side, there was a white sticker. On the front of the vehicle, in the area of the windshield, there was a front sticker. And so those characteristics were the characteristics used by law enforcement to identify that maroon Chevy Impala when steps were taken to identify locations that Henry Dinkins had traveled during the early morning hours of June 10th, and we're talking after midnight, and up to the period of noon when he presented himself to the Davenport Police Department. The black Camaro is also very distinctive in the sense that it has the face of a lion on both the driver's side of the vehicle and the passenger side of the vehicle, with king and queen noted in the area of where that lion's face is at. And then there's, that same type of design on the front hood of the Camaro. Those two vehicles remained parked and were available for use there at the address of 2744 East 53rd Street. Now, Mr. Dinkins also had a motorhome. This motorhome was located in an industrial area, actually in a fenced-in lot. And that lot belonged to a gentleman who owned Devon's, DEVON''S, self-storage. That mobile home, or RV if you will, just to give the court a perspective, I want the court to think about River Drive in the area where Credit Island is. And as you go along River Drive, heading west out of town, as you get past the Ball Diamond, you will get to an area that's very industrial. For purposes of perspective, if the court will picture where the Purina plant is located at, on Rockingham. Schmidt Road is a north-south street. It lies on the west side of the Purina plant. And just to help a little bit more, if you're traveling on 2nd Street, heading west, it turns into Rockingham. You will pass the Purina plant, and then if you were to take that first north-south road, actually turn south going down to River Drive, that's Schmidt Road. Now, if you head out onto River Drive, off of Schmidt Road, the distance from Schmidt Road to the entryway of Credit Island is about 400 meters. You know, if you run track, you run a lap around the track, it's about 400 meters. So it's very, very close. So that is going to be another vehicle and a location that we're going to be discussing. We're going back to that point in time that I was talking about where Andrea Culberson looks out the window so that the court understands where the maroon Chevy Impala comes into play. Breasia Terrell is standing along the passenger side of that maroon Chevy Impala. This raises another topic of discussion that will be discussed throughout the trial. After the children took their baths, they were not given their pajamas to wear. They were given large white t-shirts that belonged to Mr. Dinkins. And I don't remember, I think the large was like maybe, or the size was maybe like a 4XL. So rather than that child going into bed into what would have been her pajamas, she had on a little pair of black shorts. We would later determine that she had on, you know, one of those little sports bras that little girls wear, you know, as they're developing, and this large white t-shirt. Andrea Culberson looks out. She knows there's no doubt it's Breasia because she had very distinctive braids, and the child was standing there. She couldn't see the child's face because the child wasn't facing her. Going back to Mr. Dinkins, as he's digging around in that closet, he collects something from the closet. She's not able to see what it is that he collects because it's secreted in his clothes. And then he leaves the apartment. Now, another important variable that will be discussed is this. Mr. Dinkins' cell phone was located by Andrea in the apartment at 3 o'clock. Because when she noticed that he was gone, she noticed that Breasia was gone, she went to call him, the phone wasn't being answered, and then she discovered his cell phone, and it was plugged in and being charged up. When he left at 3:30, he did not take that cell phone. That becomes very important because cell phones are devices that can be utilized to gather location information for where that phone is at, and whoever is in possession of that phone, then that will identify the location of that individual. So that cell phone was still back there at the apartment. Mr. Dinkins leaves. Andrea is very unsettled. Detorius, at some point, is waking up and he's crying. I should say DL, I'm sorry. She brings the child into the living room to lay down. And then shortly after sunrise, with this being July, and sunrise is at about 5:30 in the morning, in terms of what law enforcement has been able to put together by way of a timeline, somewhere around 5:45 as an estimate, Mr. Dinkins returns to the apartment. He comes up. He's very, very frazzled. Ms. Culberson wants to know what's going on. He said, there's issues. I'll talk with you about it later. Where's Breasia? There's no Breasia. Mr. Dinkins then gathers up DL and goes to leave with a bag of the child's clothes. He goes to leave without his cell phone. Ms. Culberson tells him he needs to take his cell phone. At that point, he takes it, and then he leaves the apartment complex. Ms. Culberson then realizes that there's another bag of the children's clothing left behind, and she calls him to come back. He returns, and then she goes down to the maroon Chevy Impala. Breasia is not in the car. Detorius is in the car, Mr. Dinkins is in the car, but Breasia is not in the car. So then she goes back up to the apartment. I'm going to describe this as an area that became critical to the investigation, because anywhere that Mr. Dinkins was located, law enforcement, in terms of their investigation to try and locate this child, did major canvassing. That canvassing consisted of knocking on all of the doors there at the apartment complex, checking apartments there, if residents weren't home, to come back and check, to search garages there, to search the dumpsters, there we go, and just to search an entire area behind the apartment complex, because that's still a dedicated field area where there's a huge tree line and there's a creek, and the canvas went all along that area toward more like 74. It extended out to Eastern, to the west, and then from 53rd it extended to the south quite a ways, to see if there was any indication anybody had seen that child anywhere, had she wandered off. Discussions were had with Aisha and Danita about whether or not Breasia was the type of child who would wander off. Breasia is a child who has a hearing issue. She is a child who has a sight issue. She is a child that never wanders off. And Aisha will testify that little Breasia was a rule follower. And if somebody broke the rules, she was somebody who would tell on her brothers. The apartment complex was not a complex that she was familiar with. She'd never been there. She didn't have friends who lived there, and so she would have no need to wander off. Plus, the child was described as a very, very heavy sleeper, much like her mother and the two boys. Nothing's happened, all right? So now, you know that that's what the landscape looks in that area. By virtue of canvassing, law enforcement was also looking for any locations where there was video surveillance. Video surveillance was located at the Quick Start on 53rd. So that will lie between Jersey and Eastern. It's on the north side of the street. Between 5:50 and going up to the 6 o'clock hour, that maroon Chevy Impala travels west past the Quick Start. That maroon Chevy Impala is then identified from video surveillance at a residence on Judson Court, which actually the video surveillance camera was focused out on Eastern. So the rear of that residence faced Eastern. So the maroon Chevy Impala is traveling north on Eastern. between 5:50 and 6 o'clock. Then that maroon Chevy Impala is seen traveling south on Jersey Ridge, and then the connection between those two streets would be Veterans Memorial Parkway. That's how you would access it. So it's seen traveling south. It correlates with what Ms. Culberson says of Henry Dinkins returning to pick up that second bag of clothes, and then that vehicle then is seen from a residence over there in the area of Jersey Ridge, traveling back north. At this point, I'm going to focus on the narrative relative to Notorious, or DL. So, DL will testify that he and his father went somewhere out of town and they drove for a while. And then his father went to a Walmart store. DL noticed that his father had taken the battery out of the cell phone. And so when his father went into the Walmart, the child put the battery back into the phone so he could play a video game. That becomes a very critical moment in time, because when law enforcement became immersed in their investigation and was trying to ascertain the locations that Mr. Dinkins had traveled to, there was that ping in the area of Comanche, Clinton, and it was hitting on a cell phone tower that would be in the vicinity of the Walmart in Clinton. We're still telling the narrative relative to Notorious. When his father then comes out of Walmart, the child takes the battery out of the phone so he wouldn't get in trouble. They travel to different places. And then the child, once he was interviewed during the afternoon of June 10th, he was interviewed by Detective Hammis. Then the child left the Davenport Police Department with Detective Evan Obert, Detective Maureen Hammis, and Aisha Langford, his mother, who had been interviewed that afternoon. And then they started to travel to see if the child could identify locations. He had been with his father when they came back to Davenport. Now, to assist in that process, the following events occurred. Aisha Langford was not scheduled to work in the morning at Checkers. However, before 8 a.m., her boss called her and indicated that somebody wasn't able to come to work. Could she come on down and work the morning shift? And so she did. So she got down there around 8 o'clock, may have clocked in about 8:04. Aisha Langford had received some type of text, and the telephone records will tell us the sequence of events, from Henry Dinkins' cell phone. She will testify that she tried getting a hold of him. It wasn't happening, so she very simply sent a text, "Call me, I'm not going to, keep trying to make contact." At 8:08 a.m., there is now location information available for that phone. And that phone is hitting on cell phone towers down in the area of River Drive. So, if you go out Brady toward Clinton, you're traveling north on Highway 61. When you take the exits to go into Clinton, that's Highway 30. If you come back to Davenport, you're traveling south on 61. And then, of course, you have the ability to catch I-80 heading west. That will allow you to access Highway 280 that runs along the western border of Davenport, driving toward Rock Island. And then you can access River Drive from that area. During this time frame, there was construction there on River Drive. So then the cell phone, in terms of where it was hitting in the area of Concord and up to Rockingham. So Concord essentially would be, it winds a bit, but, you know, technically we'll call it a north-south street. And then it would access Rockingham, which would be our east-west street. Henry Dinkins, cell phone powers up. He makes the telephone call to Aisha. He tells her he has just woken up and Breasia is gone from the apartment. Aisha becomes very upset. This makes no sense. She wants to know if he has reported this to the police department, and he said that he was heading there at that time. Aisha Langford believed he was heading to the police department, and then by virtue of that cell phone activity, that then formed the basis for canvassing that was done down in that area to search for Breasia and also to look for locations where there was video surveillance that would tell the story. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to set that aside, and I'll come back to that. Aisha is hysterical. She's at work, she's crying. She will testify that her employer told her, go ahead and leave work. And then so she left Checkers to head down to the Davenport Police Department. When she pulled onto Locust Street, she headed west to go downtown. As she's heading west on Locust Street, she sees Henry Dinkins in that maroon Chevy Impala driving at an extremely high rate of speed, heading east. And she can see that Detorius is in the car. She does a U-turn. She's coming up behind him as close as she can get. She's honking on that horn to get his attention, to get him to pull over. Henry Dinkins then turns left or heads north on Eastern. And she will testify that she was right up on that bumper. Henry Dinkins then pulls in to the McDonald's. And for purposes of perspective, think of the high V there on East Kimberly Road. And that sits at the back of the lot. McDonald's is there toward the front of Kimberly Road. They pull in there. She wants to know what the heck is going on. She tells Detorius, come on, you're not going to lose this child. You've already lost one of my children. And she grabs his things and wants to know what Henry is doing in this area because he's supposed to be reporting her child missing. Mr. Dinkins tells her that he doesn't know the address for the apartment where he lives, and so he has to travel out to Jersey Meadow Apartments to get that address so that then he has that to report to the police. She follows him to that apartment complex. So I'm going to change direction relative to the events. When Aisha Langford was at work, she called the Davenport Police Department. Well, actually, she called 911 first. She spoke with the dispatcher who directed her to the general number at the Davenport Police Department. So she calls that general number and she speaks with communication specialist Mona Borelli. She's telling Mona what's going on. She said Mr. Dinkins should be there right now. Mona Borelli indicates that he is not there. She said his car has got to be out there. It's got to be either, a maroon Chevy Impala or this black Camaro. Ms. Borelli indicates it's not out there. And that's what had prompted her to leave work and head down to the police department. That call comes in at 8:29. Communication specialist Borelli will testify that this isn't the typical call that they get where mom and dad can't find the child and the police go out and they're hiding in a closet or in the bed or somewhere. This one didn't feel right, and she was very concerned because she felt that there was going to be a very bad outcome. She went She spoke with Sergeant Mayhew, who was the station supervisor. Officer Burkle was dispatched out to the Jersey Meadow Apartments. Henry is there at the apartment complex. Aisha is there at the apartment complex. And the state will introduce segments of Officer Burkle's body-worn camera. His initial contact is with Aisha. And he's trying to collect just, biographical information, age, physical descriptors, date of birth, that type of thing. And she is reporting to him what has happened. Then in the background, you see Henry Dinkins wander up, and Officer Burkle says, hey, look, do you mind if I go into the apartment to check? Because oftentimes, the child is hiding somewhere where the parent, doesn't realize where they're at. I just had this situation last week with my own child, and we typically find the child. Mr. Dinkins wants to say he already searched the apartment and the child isn't there. Officer Burkle says, I'd still like to check. So then Mr. Dinkins indicates it's not his apartment, and that essentially Officer Burkle is going to have to get the permission of Andrea Culberson. Aisha becomes very upset because she is not buying into what Henry Dinkins is saying, and she takes Notorious and she leaves. She goes back to her house and she's looking for some type of card that had Breasia's picture on it that had been taken at school. So while she's doing that, Officer Burkle knocks on apartment number 8. Andrea Culberson comes down. He indicates that, he'd like to come in and check that oftentimes children are hiding in places. Andrea Culberson looks out. She sees Henry Dinkins standing a little bit down the sidewalk. She says, is it okay with him? And then Henry Dinkins leaves. Andrea Culberson allows Officer Burkle to go in there and look for Breasia. She's not there. Officer Culberson, Officer Burkle starts to check the area, and there's nothing that's indicating Breasia's anywhere in the area. He calls his supervisor, Sergeant Willie. We have other patrol officers who come out. They start checking the area. This situation is not feeling right, and so then the Detective Bureau is contacted, and then we have massive resources that are coming out, and there is a huge canvass that's conducted along that area with nothing showing up for Breasia. Now, let's go back down to River Drive. With the cell phone hitting off the tower when that conversation occurred between Aisha and Henry at 8:08, there was video surveillance showing his maroon Chevy Impala traveling past the high V. There was video surveillance from Purina. There was what I'm going to call captured feed. Devon's self-storage is a motion-activated video system. There was the vehicle captured by virtue of movement being triggered, and then in that same area there is Jack's brake and alignment. There was video feed that showed Mr. Dinkins' vehicle traveling on Schmidt Road toward the area of River Drive. And then, based on information provided by Notorious, when Detective Hamlis, Detective Obert, and Aisha left the station, Notorious had been talking about going to the RV with his father, where his dad had this knife that he'd gone down to the river, and he walked down into the river, and he'd been wiping off with a cloth, and they went back to the RV. There was an image of Mr. Dinkins with Notorious standing there at the door of the RV. And so there was video feed that captured all of that movement that the child had identified. All right? So now, Credit Island is going to be the subject of investigation, as will be the RV. So I'm just going to stop right there, and now I'm going to jump over to the Clinton area and discuss that. By virtue of the child DL putting the battery into the phone, and with that ping, there was a canvass done along Highway 30. And actually there was a canvass done along Highway 61. The maroon Chevy Impala is captured on DOT video surveillance cameras at mile marker 124 heading north toward Clinton around 6:11 in the morning. Then on Highway 30, as you travel east into Clinton, that vehicle is captured on video feed at what would be Posh Farms, P-A-A-S-C-H. That vehicle then is captured at First State Central Bank, which is adjacent to the Walmart on the west side of the business. And then video surveillance from Walmart captures Mr. Dinkins pulling into the parking lot. He goes up to the store. It's not 7 o'clock a.m. It's locked. He comes back to the vehicle, but then he goes back. He enters at, say, at 7 a.m. And then video surveillance footage inside the store shows him buying 2 bottles of Clorox. Not the gallon-sized bottles, but more of the narrow bottles. The court's going to be hearing testimony from various forensic analysts and individuals from the DCI laboratory, our criminalists. And one of the things that the court will hear about is that Clorox is a product that will destroy DNA. Those 2 bottles of Clorox are being purchased, and then by virtue of that canvas, we have a time frame from First State Central Bank where Mr. Dinkins is leaving, a time frame for when he passes Posh Farms, and then actually in the area of Highway 61 and 30, there's a DeWitt Travel Center, there's a time frame captured there. Law enforcement will testify that they did a time calculation traveling from mile marker 124 to the Walmart, going the speed limit. They're going to tell you what that time frame would be. The trip out was longer than that, but the trip back had even 5 more minutes that was added to that. Let's take that, let's set that aside. Now we're going to talk about the discovery of Breasia's remains. 6 months later, on March 22nd of 2021, 3 gentlemen, friends, decided to go fishing on the evening of March 22nd. There's a pond located just further north of the Highway 30 exit into Clinton. So if you travel 5 miles further north, you exit onto what would be 212th Street. This is a rural area. Kunow Implement is a farm implement business that sits right there on 212th Street. And 212th then turns into 210th. So the business actually faces, the front of the business faces north, basically on 212, 210. It's on a pie-shaped piece of property. So on the west side of that property, which would run along Highway 61, and what we would think of as the old Highway 61, is 218. On the east side of the property, and that would be that north-south road, that's 270th Avenue. So you've got 212th, 218th, and 217th, and basically it feeds down where 218th and 270th meet. To the south of Kunow Implement, there is a heavily wooded area. And within the backside of that property, there is a pond. You can access that pond from 270th. There is basically just a dirt road that's got a very steep incline because Kunow Implement sets up much higher. The pond is further down. That roadway, you will hold testimony, is very steep, and for a car to pull down in there would be very difficult and probably get stuck. When the three gentlemen went to go fishing, they were walking down that steep incline, having parked their pickup trucks up on the road. And because we're talking about March 22nd, there's no vegetation. One of the gentlemen looks over to what would be his right as he's walking down, looks to the north essentially, and he sees a human skull. He points it out to his two friends. They go over and check, and sure enough, it is a human skull, and there are skeletal remains. One of the things that the gentleman noticed is that there is black hair consistent with a black individual. Because Breasia Terrell and her having been missing was so highly publicized, the gentleman will testify that at some point they made the connection. Is this Breasia Terrell's remains? The Clinton County Sheriff's Department was contacted. They come out, the scene is cordoned off, and then essentially the notifications go to the Davenport Police Department. Throughout the entirety of this investigation, you had Davenport Police involved, you had the FBI involved, you had the Iowa DCI involved, we had multiple agencies from like Clinton Police Department, Clinton County Sheriff's Department, and just citizens in the community who would come out and donate time, just helping to do canvases in areas. And then so that area then was processed the next morning with a Dr. Heather Garvin. She's an anthropologist associated with the State Medical Examiner's Office. And because we were dealing with skeletal remains, she was brought in. There was the local medical examiner. Those remains were recovered, sent to the State Medical Examiner's Office. One of the things that the court will hear testimony about is that one of the little legs still had mummified tissue on it. And so then there was the process of trying to develop DNA through that mummified tissue. However, they ended up using bone marrow. They could identify that body as being a female child of Aisha Langford because there was no DNA for Breasia, but because a child takes half of their mother's DNA, half of their father's DNA, they could say this was a female child of Breasia. And then Breasia, because of her dental visits, they were then able to get her dental records, and then with the collection of teeth, put that all together, and there was that definitive identification that was made of Breasia. So the court's going to be hearing about that and everything associated with that recovery. And then on April 3rd, during the recovery of the body, this is what was discovered, and during the examination of little Breasia's body by the anthropologist in the State Medical Examiner's Office. She had been shot through the jaw. The bullet had traveled to the area of her C3 and C4. She had been shot in her back scapula. 2 projectiles were recovered in the dirt with the remains. And then within her hair, there was a projectile that was found within her hair. And then the clothing that was recovered at the scene was little black shorts, her little sports bra, and the large white t-shirt. And in addition, Aisha Langford will tell you that she was asked by law enforcement to try and give them any information about clothing the child had been wearing. So she had to go back and try and reconstruct what she had been wearing. She thought that there was a possibility that it was a pink flip-flop, but then there was a little white slide that had turquoise on it, and that was found there, which was identified as belonging to Breasia. All right. Then on April 3rd, the Big River Rescue and Recovery Team came out to the scene, and then the dive team went into the pond looking for a gun, and there was actually a revolver that was found. So with the revolver, obviously there's not going to be any casings because there was an attempt to try and find casings in the area. There wasn't any. With the finding of the revolver, and the projectiles obviously leaving the gun, the empty casings were there. There was still some light ammunition there. There was attempts to try and identify who had purchased that gun. Unfortunately, the records associated with that were in Cedar Rapids, and when there was that big flood, in the area of the courthouse and all of that, all of the records were destroyed. Those projectiles were then sent to the DCI laboratory to do comparisons with the gun itself. One of the projectiles was pretty mangled up, and because these had been out in the elements for quite a while, the criminalist who evaluated that looked at the characteristics of the revolver and what characteristics would be transferred to a bullet by virtue of the manufacturing process and how the barrel itself will have unique markings. He could say that what characteristics that were there were similar to this gun, and then the criminals put together a list of every type of gun that would produce those types of similar characteristics. The gun recovered was on that list. There was DNA processing done of her little clothing. One of the issues that law enforcement was dealing with the little body and clothing being out there subject to the elements, the sun, the wind, the rain, the snow, obviously over time, that will destroy DNA. And so that process was attempted as well. And then from the FBI, here's what you're going to hear from the FBI. There were search warrants, a massive amount of search warrants issued. And in instances like with the Chevy Impala or different vehicles, multiple search warrants issued. The vehicles were photographed and they were searched. Of note, in the Chevy Impala, there was an axe, there was a baseball bat, but then there was an empty sleeve for like a knife or a machete, but no machete there. When they were recovering the remains of Breasia Terrell, there was a bunch of tree branches and stuff on top of the skeletal remains. Some of those branches, there were natural breaks, with the wind, and there would be the splintering of the branch if it comes off of a tree. Other branches had a clean slice through it. So that was of interest to law enforcement. Notorious had described when he and his father went down to Credit Island, his father had walked off into an area toward like what would be the pond, and his father had a knife that he was wiping off. Law enforcement went down to that area, and there were foot impressions in the dirt where you could see what would have been the pattern on the sole of the shoes worn. That was photographed and that was collected, and then as those footprints moved forward to the body of water, that basically it became just, depressions in the ground where it was more muddy. And so those photographs and those casts were taken because one of the things that Aisha Langford talked about is when she had contact with Henry Dinkins at the apartment, she noticed that he was wearing a pair of gold shoes that had mud on them. He had a do-rag on, and it was just kind of askew. And he had on a white T-shirt, and it was a little dirty. Not something that was markedly dirty, but she noticed that it was dirty. Henry Dinkins came down to the Davenport Police Department at noon and was interviewed by Detective Owen. When he came down, he had on a white T-shirt and the shorts that he was wearing at the apartment complex. But those gold shoes, he was not wearing those. He had on a different pair of tennis shoes. And then the other thing that the state will throw into the equation that the court will hear about, during Henry Dinkins' interview, he was asked about why he was leaving the apartment in the middle of the night in his travels. He had talked about going to the Quick Shop over on 53rd, that would be near the old Menards, where the old Menards was at, to buy cigarettes. That video surveillance feed was collected. He was wearing those gold shoes, but then he had on something distinctly different. What I'm going to call the white T-shirt versus one that has sleeves, and then a different pair of shorts, that had different pattern. Search warrants were obtained for 2744 East 53rd, and the defendant's sister's house, Nina McQuay, and then another individual by the name of Genesis Johnson, and that was based on communications that Henry Dinkins had with those individuals that morning of July 10th, looking for the tennis shoes, looking for what the clothes that he'd been wearing in the quick shop, and those were never ever recovered or found. And so therefore, there could be no comparison between the images that were collected and the dental casts that were taken out on Credit Island. There was a gentleman by the name of Jim Peters then who came in from the Ames area to assist. He works with canines, and these canines are trained to detect on the odor of a deceased body. VOC, and he'll define that, volatile organic compounds. And basically, it deals with molecules. He went down to Credit Island and ran his 2 canines in that area. The 2 canines went to an area and alerted where Henry Dinkins was described by his son D.L. as having gone. He'll talk about how a body doesn't necessarily have to be there, but say, for example, if there's tissue or blood or something like that, those are molecules that go out and they float in the air. Then he was taken to the area of Devon Self-Storage, where the RV had originally been parked, but it now had been seized, as had the Impala and the Camaro, and those were in storage facilities that law enforcement had. The dogs actually alerted to a little camper that was parked in the area of the RV, and there had been a southwest wind, so with molecules, they were alerted to some moist dirt underneath that camper. And he will describe how molecules will attach to anything that's moist. Then they went out to the area where the Camaro was at. The dogs did not alert there. They went to the area of the RV. The dogs alerted on the RV toward the front. And then they went to the area where the Impala was at, and the dogs alerted on the Impala. And then they went out to the area along Veterans Memorial Drive in the area of Eastern, and he'll describe how a vehicle, with the seams, odors will seep out of that and they can float, and the dogs alerted to the scent of Henry Dinkins, because when he went out there, he had been given, or law enforcement had collected a clothing item of Henry Dinkins, and there had been swabs taken to collect his scent, his odor, that had been shown to the dogs, and the dogs actually went out and alerted in an area that the vehicle was known to travel past. So the court will be hearing about that as well. The other matter that I would share in my opening, in addition to the canvass up at 2744 East 53rd, the major canvass that was done out on East River Drive, you'll hear about some other canvasses that happened when the public would call in and they would think that they would have information. It didn't prove to be fruitful. When it had been determined that Henry Dinkins had been traveling along Highway 30, there was a major canvass that was done in that area. And soil samples were collected from that area. Soil samples were also collected from Credit Island, and here's why. With the Impala, when it was being searched and examined, and actually the gas tank was removed because they wanted to determine how much gas was in the gas tank. Henry Dinkins had fuel up at that quick shop, so they wanted to see how much gas was left. There were chunks of mud and grass up underneath the car. And then when Breasia's little remains were found over there in the area of Kunal Implement, there were soil samples collected along that area. All of that was sent off to the FBI. 3 soil samples in the area of 270th Avenue were found inclusive of 3 of the 4 soil samples that were taken out from underneath Henry Dinkins' car. And then the final topic of conversation is a gentleman by the name of Jared Brink. With the discovery of her remains, the news story started to go out. Jared Brink had gone over that evening to his friend Joseph Adams' house. Joseph Adams indicated that they had found remains over there in the area of Kunal Implement. And Jared had mentioned to his friend, do you remember how I told you last year sometime that there had been a black gentleman that had run out onto Highway 61 when I was going into work and had needed me to pull him out because he had gotten stuck? For purposes of perspective, Jared Brink lives in a rural area just further north of 212th Street. He works at Linwood Mining in Buffalo. So he travels into Davenport and travels that area of the highway at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. That's when he had an encounter with a black gentleman. He was directed over to the area of 270th. There was a maroon Chevy Impala that the right side of the vehicle, the wheels were stuck off onto the shoulder, and that gentleman couldn't get the vehicle out. He was up there at the car. There was no one in the car. He pulled the vehicle out. The gentleman wanted to pay him money and was very, very thankful he wouldn't take the money. But then, of course, when Mr. Adams tells him about this, Mr. Adams' wife has a picture of the maroon Chevy Impala due to press releases that the Davenport Police Department had been putting out. She showed him a copy of that photograph. Jared Briggs says that that's the vehicle I pulled out. He then contacted law enforcement. He had contact with the Deputy Cundiff with the Clinton County Sheriff's Department, Lieutenant Cundiff reached out to the Davenport Police Department, and then Mr. Brink was interviewed. Mr. Brink could provide physical descriptors that were consistent with Henry Dinkins. He was not able to, he said he would not be able to pick him out of a photo lineup. He wasn't sure of the time frame, but then he provided his cell phone, and that cell phone then was processed for location information, and that cell phone placed Mr. Brink in that area on July 10th at the time frame of 4:30. So that essentially is what the court is going to be hearing. What the state's going to do, Your Honor, we're going to try and, in an ideal world, I would put on a linear chronology of what happened, but we're dealing with a lot of people that we have to fly in and out. And so things are going to get jumbled around. But just for purposes of perspective, this afternoon we will have Borelli, who will be testifying. That was our communications specialist. Our civilian crime scene technician, Jill Foster, she's going to come in. She did the processing out there on Credit Island. And then we have another civilian crime scene, Alicia Fritz, who will be coming in. She's going to be talking about photographs that she took of the brush when Breasia's remains were recovered, but she's getting ready to have a baby, and she'll be induced on Monday. And then we're going to have Officer Chris Mayer get on the stand. He actually was out in the area of Breasia's remains, and he helped to take measurements of where, like, we would find the skull and where we would locate various skeletal remains and clothing. So it's going to be all over the place there, Your Honor. We'll do our best, but there will be points in time where we have to put people on, and it's not a nice linear chronology. And that's all from the state.
Thank you, Ms. Cunningham. Mr. Freese, is the defense going to present an opening statement?
Your Honor, the defense is going to reserve its right to make an opening statement to the close of the government's evidence.
All right. Thank you very much. That'll conclude the proceedings this morning. Ms. Cunningham.
Your Honor, one of the things that I had asked, because of we've got time concerns that we have to get witnesses on this afternoon. They're flying in and they're flying out. What I would like to do is, if we could take advantage of the next hour, put Sergeant Piper on the stand to testify, because then we can get maps introduced of the area so that we have that perspective as we move through individuals' testimony.